Welcome to the Eye of Power podcast. I'm your host, Tom Dardick. But this podcast is not about me. It's about you and your power. It's time to claim yours. Today on the Eye of Power podcast, it's my pleasure to welcome Steve McCready to the show. Steve is a psychotherapist by trade and became a coach. And so that's one of the things we start off talking about, the intersection between coaching and therapy, because this gets a little murky and there's supposed to be a dividing line. And sometimes that dividing line can be a little difficult to see. So somebody like himself, I think a unique view as to what that is. And so Steve and I talk about that, and we get into a whole bunch of topics regarding the coaching as a profession, as how people make moves, make improvements in their lives, and all things related to the Eye of Power model. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Steve McCready to the show. I think we're kind of birds of a feather in that sense, because I'll tell you, one of the things, I've never called myself as a coach.
Okay.
I've been a consultant, and the reason I don't think of a coach is I always thought of coaching as sort of a bad word, in the sense that of the coaches that I saw in the orbit around me, it just seems sort of too easy. Like you can come up, you can roll into somebody's life or somebody's business and give them the bullet points of things that they should do different, and then you get to go on with your life, and they get to stew in it, right? And I didn't like that dynamic at all. While I don't see a way to totally do away with that. It's something that I try to fight against, and part of it is going to what's real. So what happens is it seems to me like there's sort of this gray area between a coaching relationship, and then as you get into actual psychology and a deeper dive into what's really going on with people, and there's this sort of mushy area that separates sort of the two professions. And I saw on your profile, Steve, that you are trained as a psychoanalyst and now working as a coach. So that area is probably not so murky for you in your practice. So that's the area that really grabbed my attention, and I'd like to explore first, if we could.
Yeah, totally. So it's actually, I would say, yes, it's actually very murky. I would completely agree with you. I'm not a big fan of the term coach either. I use it because it's what people understand, right? And from just a simple marketing standpoint, if you start, I could come up with some word that maybe does it better, but it's just going to make people go, huh?
What?
And that's not really good. So I use it, even though it's not the best label, and it has a lot of associations. And there's some people who use the term coach when they're really meaning like consultant. And then even within coaching, there's this big realm from the people who will literally never give advice whatsoever to more of a hybrid. And at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is I'm trying to help people get from where they are to where they want to be, and to navigate what is, as we all know, like a difficult, challenging journey that has a lot of obstacles. And we're not always equipped to either navigate around or through those, or we don't even necessarily see them. And so my job is, in a lot of ways, I would liken it to the role of a Sherpa in mountain climbing. They know the path, they've walked it, they've been there, and they can help you know how to, travel it successfully. So that would be it. And obviously, because yes, my background being psychotherapy, there's a very bit of a psychological and mental component to my work and where I focus in it. But it is murky and messy. And I think the label piece is less important than really the thing of, what am I doing, and what's my role in my client's life, or for any coach. And that really, I know a lot of coaches and therapists too. It varies widely about how we work with people and where we engage. It is definitely there's no one word that could capture all of us, I think.
It is. And I mean, at heart, what we're doing is, we're two human beings. If it's a one-on-one scenario, two human beings with an intent to get to where we want to go together. And there are certain requirements. And in the Eye of Power model, we have a guide system, and I don't call them coaches or anything like that. A guide is simply a person who wants the best outcome for you and is honest and courageous enough to share what they really think and be willing to go there and get real. And
Mhm.
those are the other things are variables.
Yeah, I mean, I think guide is definitely a term that could be used and could characterize it, pretty well. But
Now, the
again, it's
Sherpa, I
one
mean,
of
a Sherpa is a guide,
sure,
right? I mean,
right, it is a form of guide. But at the end of the day, yeah, it really comes down to this. It's like somebody who is supporting you on the journey, because all of us, no matter how much we've learned, known, done, we all have blind spots. We all have areas where we weren't maybe given what we needed or given what we ideally would have had, and that can be so limiting. That's like the thing for me is I know that from my own experience. I've seen it with other people who have these really wonderful things they can contribute to the world, but also obstacles that prevent that. And so, for me, like my whole goal is helping get that out of the way for people so they can really be and do what they're here to do, and do their part to just help us all as a society kind of figure this life thing out, which is kind of challenging.
well, if it wasn't challenging, it wouldn't be worth doing, right?
Right. Well, it would also be probably kind of boring.
Exactly.
That's the catch, right? Is it's like if it's not challenging, it gets kind of boring. If it's too challenging, it gets overwhelming. So we've got to find this kind of sweet spot in the middle, right?
Yeah, and that's why it's beautiful that there's such a spectrum of experience and such a wide range of possibility for people. And we decide, right? We set the thermometer of what we think is acceptable and not. And, there's, of course, there's some level one sorts of things. If you don't show up, if you have a character that makes it so people can't trust you in any way, you're walling off a whole range of possibility for yourself. So there's some table stakes. But then once you can get to that level, then it's a wide range. We can write our story, and it can be so many, as many people as there are. That's how many stories can be. And I find it absolutely wonderful, and one of the best things about life that's worth looking at and investing our attention.
No, I would agree. And I mean, I would think I'm increasingly of the mind that probably we are all meant to maybe, I don't know, meant to, but certainly capable of doing a wide range of things. In my own, like my own career, like I've worked in radio, I worked as an IT guy, I've done the psychotherapy thing, now I'm doing the coaching, and these all in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of different elements to them, some aspects that overlap, but they all in their own way have been really enjoyable work, really special work, and really challenging. And so it's like, I think it's so easy for us to limit ourselves or to feel limited. And I just that's such an awful place to be. And I,
Mhm.
I know that pain, and I don't want anyone else to experience it. And again, that's been always a fundamental piece of what drives me wanting to do this work, is to help free people in a lot of ways so they can do the big things that they want to do.
Well, I got to say, you've got a great broadcasting voice, so I'm not surprised to hear about a radio background for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long, long time ago now, but that was one of those things. And unfortunately, it shows up like if I'm ever talking to anything that's getting recorded, like I'll leave friends voicemails and they'll be like, "Why are you using your DJ voice?" I'm like, it just happens. I'm sorry.
That's funny. So let's get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts about how you encounter people and some of the things that I've noticed. We can sort of compare notes a little bit, and maybe we'll shine the light in some areas for people they hadn't previously considered. Um, when I think of that intersection between psychotherapy and coaching, I think about like the coaches or some of the coaching methodologies that I've witnessed in the world are what I'll call the hammer and nail approach, where it's you just do this, just keep doing this, and if you do this, eventually you'll succeed, and that might work. And oh, write down your number of dollars you're going to earn in this month, and very sort of coarse kind of cognitive visionary, let's just say. And I find that maybe it works for some people. That definitely does not work for everybody. And
No.
so, right?
Yeah. So this is like the whole just do it methodology, right? Or just
Yes,
do it
yeah,
concept,
exactly. That's
which
it's
it works for some people. I think you're right. I
so
mean, obviously, and it not only fails miserably for some people, but it actually can be shaming for them because
Yes.
they're like, why can't I just
What's
do it? Right.
what's
And it's
wrong
like,
with
well,
me?
yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, guess what? There's actually nothing wrong with you. Right. It's just not that simple for everyone. And so I agree. And that is like one of the areas right where I focus, because it's like, yeah, if you can't just follow and do the thing, and it's not about just the structure and the accountability, those things are important, but often there's obstacles, there's things in the way, there's stuff in our heads. I had an old coach who used to always refer to it as head trash, which I thought was kind of a fun way to reference it, that we need, we need to take out and we need to deal with. And if we don't do that, it does not matter how many goals you set, how much accountability you have, all that, that's not enough by itself for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I that trap you pointed to, Steve, where it was where you turn the blame back on yourself and ask disempowering questions rather than ones that are going to fill you, and you know take inventory of what's there, not what's not there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, and obviously the listeners won't see this, but Tom can. Like in the background in my room here, I've got a thing on the wall that says, it doesn't say just do it, it says just start.
Ah.
And in credit, so this is I want to credit Peter Reynolds, because that's his. He's a children's author, an illustrator, but he wrote this book called The Dot. And the whole core idea of it is just start with a dot and see where it takes you. And the reason why I like that, because that's really the key, is you've got to find what's a thing you can do. Start where you are and then work from there and then build up. Right. You start with a dot, see where it takes you. And that feels a lot more manageable, right? It's not just do it. It's just gotta get moving and figure out, how do you get moving? And then we figure out, how do you move faster? How do you go further? How do you go more focused? But that's all stuff that gets built up over time and iteration.
Yeah, it's that which we can do and sustain, right? So we start where we
Yeah.
actually can move, and it might be a real baby step. I often talk about this when I'm working with people for positive change. I don't really care if you're making giant strides or just tiny little baby steps. All you really need is motion. If you've
Yes.
got motion, we're in good shape. If we don't have motion, or if we're going the other way, then that's where we got issues.
Oh, totally. It's so much like the part of getting from not being in motion to being in motion is such a big part of the challenge, and really figuring out, how do we shrink that down so that we can get in motion in some form, right? And then, yes, staying in motion. That's what I just tell people. It's like that whole thing about what's the best form of exercise, and the answer is, well, the one you'll do regularly.
Right.
And yeah, there's
That,
a total lesson there. That's true for, I think, almost anything, because there's always more than one way to navigate.
that's what's so good about the pickleball craze, right? People are having a
Right.
blast and they're moving, and I don't care if it's a better or worse exercise than
Right.
something else. You're out there doing something, moving, using your body, you getting some cardio going, whatever it is. And that's way better than sitting at the computer or watching TV or, lounging around.
Oh,
And
it's huge, because
yeah,
it's
so
like we've got to be able to utilize that drive, or that thing that, again, that, how do we tune into ourselves and what we will do, and this is true just even with things like exercise. And that's why, like, for me, it's like cycling instead of running, because I can't stand running, but I'll
mm,
ride on my bike for hours. Like, okay. But it's true when we get into things like business, and what do we do in business, or what do we do in life? And that's where I think bringing some of the emotion piece comes in too, because then we start to get into values, or things that really matter to us. And again, that's another place where there's a lot of power available if we're willing to tap into it, I think.
well, that steers us a little bit into some of the things that you help people focus on, the traps of, let's say, perfectionism or
Yeah.
overthinking things, maybe anxiety management. So, what do you notice that maybe stereotypical, and what might be a broad brushstroke of somebody listening who, let's just say, they would consider themselves, they could relate to being a perfectionist, or that they overthink and underact? What would be some of the things you might share with them, Steve, that might be a little nugget that can move them forward?
Learning to change your relationship with failure, and I would put failure in quotes there, is really everything, I think. Because we get caught up in this idea of I have to perform, I have to be perfect, I can't make mistakes, all of these things, which are very inaccurate. They are unfortunately reinforced by so much of what's in the world, right? We see everyone's highlight reels. We don't see their outtakes necessarily, or if we do, we see it in these like fail videos that are basically people making fun of people for their mistakes.
Right.
And what we don't get is an accurate picture. Right. I talked about this. I have kind of become the unofficial photographer for my daughter's soccer team.
Huh.
And I'm not a great photographer by any means. I'm okay. But people see the stuff that I post and they're like, "Oh my God, you're such a good photographer." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's because they're only seeing the things I post. They're not seeing the like, thousands of garbage photos that I'm like, what the heck was that?" Right. And so I think that's it. We've got to change our relationship with failure, and we've got to see failure as not such a big deal, number one. And number two, a tremendous opportunity. But to do that, we have to get more comfortable with it, I think. And when it's a monster under the bed, right? It's this imaginary thing that we believe is there, we're told it's there, and we're just talking about it in our head and we just build it up. We can make it into something gigantic and awful. But when we start to experience it and we start to pay attention and go, okay, I did this thing, I did it badly, or I put this out there and no one cared, or whatever it is. And then we go, oh, nothing happened. Number one, it's like, okay, so the monster is not a monster. It's just that stuffed animal that, got put under the bed months ago. But two, then we have the opportunity to go, all right, what can I learn from this? What can I take here? What's here? Because there's always something. It may be something small, may not be the thing we were looking for. And then we go, how do I build on that? And how do I go again? And then get some feedback. How do I build on that? How do I go again? So it's this do, iterate, repeat kind of cycle. And that builds over time. If we do it right, a spiral, I like to say, because our performance, our skill, our refinement, it all improves if we look at it that way. And that is the path to really doing great things with anything, with anything.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the classic Edison quote where, I didn't fail 10,000. I just found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. That's
Exactly.
yeah. So that's that. And it's so easy. We were talking earlier about being musicians, and when you're performing, you know what you meant to do. You know what you thought it should sound like in your head. So then when you do something that doesn't sound like that to you, you think it's a mistake. And then if we would poll the audience or even the people in the band with you, how many of them actually noticed that it was different than what you thought, therefore a mistake or a failure? And I'm going to say it's less than 1%, and maybe way less than 1% of the time that anybody would even know the difference.
I think you're probably exactly right. And they've seen that with other areas too. I know one of the things that's been studied in the realm of psychotherapy is what is the difference between how therapists experience therapy and how clients do. And there's all these times like it's like therapists think like, oh, I offered this great intervention and this great observation or whatever. And then you ask clients like the stuff that stuck out to them and it's totally different. And I've seen that when I've informally talked with both coaching and therapy clients, like about like, okay, so what are you taking away from this? Or what's the part that's valuable to you? And it's something that I hadn't even thought about, right? Or even noticed. And the thing I was like, either worried about like, oh, that was kind of lame or whatever. Yeah. Didn't even register on the radar. So it's like, we think that we see everything accurately, but the unfortunate and uncomfortable truth is like, no, we see everything in this really pretty severely distorted way. So again, don't believe everything you think because it's not accurate.
That's a good one. I'm writing that one down.
I saw that on a bumper sticker somewhere. It was the first place I ever encountered it. So again, like really anything, I can't take credit for creating a whole lot of anything. I'm just good at synthesizing it into useful bits and figuring out where to apply it. But I love it. I keep looking. I want to find a bumper sticker and put that on my car because I think it's like, yeah, we all could stand to have that as a reminder.
Yeah, really. There's two things that you highlighted there, Steve, that resonate to me. One thing in terms of what people take away. My experience in that it's always more fundamental than what I would have thought. In other words, it's easy if you get into a field. You and I are experts at what we do because we've been doing it a while and have studied and put our energy towards that. And it's super, super easy. And then it doesn't matter what the field is. Anybody in that, whatever their area of expertise or focus is, it's really easy to lose sight of all those things that you learned that are second nature and in muscle memory now. and lose connection to the people that are novice or just coming into that world for the first time. One of the classic examples to me is when you go into an organization or a field where they've got their jargon, right? So they assume you know what an NTSA is, right? It's like,
Right.
I went to a conference. It was a military conference once. It was unbelievable. 2 days. I'm writing down all the acronyms, and I'm catching up, but it's like it was
Yeah,
impossible. It was insane, and that's
yeah,
probably the worst example. But I think we all do that to some degree, and it's something that I know for me, I really have to put my effort towards staying in the beginner mindset more.
totally. I think that, yeah, beginner's mind is such a powerful concept, or approaching just really the idea. I tend to focus on with clients, focusing on being curious,
Oh,
right?
yes,
Trying to
yes,
bring this
yes.
open curiosity, and and like just wonder and sit with it, like what's going on, because we have these conclusions, and sometimes they're right. It's not that they're not, but they're often incomplete. Sometimes they're wrong. They're often distorted in some form, and when we hang out with it and kind of wonder or whatever, it starts to look different. And it is your point about like how it looks from the expert perspective versus how it looks from the not expert perspective. Those things are so radically different, and it's really easy to lose sight of it. Although there are things that always remind us. It's like when you try and teach your kid how to tie their shoes.
Hmm.
You don't even think about it. In fact, thinking about it makes it worse because you've been doing it for decades. And then your kid's like, I can't do that. And you're like, why is this so hard? Well,
I have a funny story about that. Why you mentioned that one, Steve? Uh, Probably when I was maybe I'm going to say late 30s, early 40s. Somebody who was she was a massage therapist. She saw my shoe was untied, and she said, "How do you tie your shoes?" So I went and tied my shoes the way I'd been doing my entire life. She said, if you just do it, just take this, loop it one more time like that, your shoe will never come untied. I've been doing it ever since. I haven't had so so things that are basic, we can still learn. So that falls back into what you pointed to with the utility or the saving grace of curiosity and being in that. Because what is it really? It's not it's a humility, right? It's a staying in the wonder, the sense of exploration, the sense of play, the sense of openness, the sense of I already have learned that, so, and which is a limiting factor, not an opening one, because we just have to respect what the world really is. It's way more complicated than our little powers of perception can actually grasp.
well, actually, yes. Right. I mean, that's the thing, is our brains are trying to protect us by filtering out a bunch of information so we don't
Yeah.
get totally overwhelmed. And of course, we live in a world that's so wildly information saturated that our filters get kind of overwhelmed anyway, but in a different way. But yeah, if we tried to take all this in, our brains, I mean, they wouldn't explode, but they would effectively explode, right? It's just like, it's just too much. It's too much data to process.
Yeah, we just don't have the bandwidth.
Right. And so that's one of the things the brain does to try and cope, is it's like, well, I'm going to filter, and I'm filtering on what I think is important or relevant. And sometimes it gets it right, and sometimes it gets it really wrong.
Well, this is some of the problem that people who are either on a spectrum or their brain isn't working as the typical, say, blueprint would. And if they can't filter these things out, they really have problems in the modern
Yes.
world, especially.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's because there's just so much. But I think for all of us, right, this is one of the areas that becomes important in trying to really navigate any path, I think, is there is so much stuff out there. And if you pay too much attention to too much of it, you will be pulled in a million different directions, and you're not going to go anywhere except in some really ragged circle. And so learning not only what to keep out or to block out, but how to really build your own set of fairly comprehensive filters is even more important today, I think, than it ever has been. But it's just crucial, because otherwise you're going to be just, yeah, you're going to be hopelessly lost in a sea of noise, I think.
So the way that at least I've learned to deal with that is kind of using models, using things that help us. The model's never the territory, the map's not the territory, but it helps orient us and get us so that we're not missing something or going in the wrong direction or thinking this one thing when this other thing matters more. So they help in that way. What other ways would you coach somebody to build those filters or kind of get oriented towards what they would say matters most for them?
Right. And part of it is that question of what matters to you, right? what matters to you, what do you stand for, also though, what do you stand against,
Mhm.
but what doesn't matter to you. I think those are all things that start to build, a rough but a filter that you can use. And then really just starting to also look at things like what sort of what are the ways in which you take in information and knowledge and learning that work well. Give you an example. Audiobooks, right? I used to be a huge fan of listening to nonfiction audiobooks because what I would do is I'd listen on my bike ride, right? I'd be
Mm.
out riding my bike. I'm like, cool, I'm learning while I'm riding and it's
Yeah.
great. And it is and it isn't, because
Right.
what happens is because I'm writing, I can't be taking notes while I'm doing it. And the information didn't get very well absorbed for me. Now, other people really hold that well and it works great for them. So I'm not trying to, say that that's not an effective tool. I'm saying it's not for me. And learning that about myself has been really important, right? The same way that, as an example for me, I can't use when I'm trying to learn a thing, I can't follow a strict recipe. It's too rigid. And what happens
Mhm.
is I one get caught up in just the recipe and not really understanding the concepts. And two, I tend to kind of push back against it. But to
Mhm.
give me a framework and I'm great, where there's like, here's this, here's this general path and here's room to play. And so a lot of it is for us understanding, how do we learn? How do we improve? Where have we been able to do that? And keeping that in mind with the things we choose to either bring in or choose not to bring in. So like audiobooks, to come back to what I started with, I still listen to audiobooks, but they're either fiction audiobooks or they're nonfiction ones that are things that are not so much like learning and growing, more like biographies or
Mm.
history type things, or things like that.
The kind of stuff you're not taking notes about, but
That
you're
I'm not
just
taking
you're
notes about.
enjoying.
Yeah, it's more of an enjoyment or of an entertainment, or more we're really just pulling the rough, sketch there, because there are places where having the audio is a great fit, right? It's like I can't exactly read a book in the shower,
Yeah.
but I can listen to something. And just really learning that, or again, learning how to process the information. Again, for me, like video with certain things is helpful, but for me with a lot of things, I find it just distracting and another data stream to try and manage.
Right.
You know, it's like give me a book, or give me some with some experiments or things to try, and then give me some space to play. But that's me, right? So I'm always with people really exploring, where have you had successes? Where have you struggled? What works? What doesn't? And then working on building systems and structures and constraints and filters to drive yourself where you're using those things, right? And that, so it looks radically different for everyone. And this is why I think things like coaching and therapy and any sort of support can be valuable, because again, we're all different, right? What works for you, what works for me, not the same. And a book is probably not going to be able to help you fully sort that out, because books tend to be more prescriptive by just the nature of how they are. But that means that they don't necessarily work for every person, which is also why there can be 200 books on a subject and they all can have some value.
Sure. Well, and they don't help us with the blind spots. We need another soul,
Yes.
right? We need another person, because we all have the blind spots and there's nothing we can do, and we could bemoan our fate because of that, but I personally think it's a beautiful thing. We need other people, and I think that's part of where we get our meaning in life. So um, and then if we can get in the more the habit and embrace that reality, right? That it's not a character flaw to need somebody else. It's not a weakness.
Right.
It's a strength to be able to gain the benefit of the perspective of another person, because you've built the ability to try their perspective on for size and really try it on, right?
It's another form of openness, right?
Yeah.
It's that acknowledgement that like you don't know everything, you can't, and the way to learn and grow is by being open to the fact of being wrong, right? Right now I'm reading Adam Grant's book Think Again,
Okay.
and that's like a fundamental idea of that book, and it's a really good read. I'm really enjoying it. I like his books. And it's totally that thing of like, we've got to be open to the fact that we don't know everything, and again, that's okay. And that's one of the things that I think is a place we really get tripped up. It's like the perfectionism is this idea that our worthiness is somehow predicated on being right or get everything. And it's like, not really. because all people who've really done great things, if you look, you're going to see, if you dig in enough, a learning process and openness. And in fact, in a lot of cases, actively seeking contrary ideas or other thoughts, right? It's the people who get these stubborn things and get stick that eventually they might shine for a while, but they inevitably will crash and burn.
Right, because everything is dynamic, including themselves, right?
Right.
So to think in terms of that, get the thing and hold on, is not going to get to the highest level that way. We have to be thinking in terms of process, dynamic, system. We are part. Like I often, it comes up in just thinking, to realize we think of ourselves as this singular being, and even that is a incomplete definition of what we really are. We are a collection of beings that are cooperating. There's 9 times the amount of cells in our body that don't have human DNA, that without them we don't have anything. So it's a way more complicated picture than the simple shorthand of me and this particular idea or this particular desired outcome. Having said all of that, like we said, we have to filter, we have to get down, we have to understand I like how you laid out the values, Steve. That the question I have coming out of that is, that you've pointed out in some of your work, is that basically effective metrics, right? Making sure we're measuring things that matter the most. So I'd like to steer us into that realm a little bit as to what are some of the things that you noticed when it comes to either changing or expanding somebody's view of how
Sure.
they're measuring success.
Right. No, I love this topic. It's one I've been thinking about a lot lately because it is an area where I think we really, really get screwed up and there's just a lot of potential there. So the example I'll use to start with, which is only going to work for baseball fans, but that's okay, is for years, everyone used to think of runs batted in, right? RBIs as this really meaningful stat. And like people with a lot of RBIs is like, oh, they're a big power hitter and whatever.
Yep.
But when the real statisticians started digging into baseball and started studying it, they realized that like, no, it's a statistic of opportunity, right? It doesn't necessarily indicate a whole lot of anything. And so it's not seen in the same way. And part of that is because, again, it's a stat of opportunity. There are pieces of it you don't control. And that's the part I want to highlight. When we start measuring based on things we do not have control over, we're setting up a problem, right? Because we are basically going to be in a situation where we're trying to evaluate ourselves based on something we don't have control over. And like that leads to things like dishonesty. It leads to like manipulation and control. It leads to all kinds of stuff. So I'm
resentment towards people not delivering.
Totally. Yes, absolutely. So my take is what we want to do is we want to look for metrics that, one, yeah, ideally they're easy to track, because if they're a pain in the butt to track, no one's going to bother. But two, that they are process metrics that you control that have alignment with desired outcomes, right? So as an example, if you make more sales calls, you are probably going to close more deals, right? It's again a simplistic example, but that's it. And if you focus on, instead of like, how do I close more deals? It's like, well, work backwards from there. And one of them is, yeah, make more calls. One of them is, right, refine, and this isn't so much a metric, refine like who are you reaching out to. But it's always that kind of a thing of thinking about that is, what are the things that I can track that are within my control and that relate to the outcome. So that's always a place that I try and start. And just really, again, like I said, keeping it simple, because if you have to track 5 or 6 different things, it's not going to happen. And usually there's a couple of key things you can monitor and know that if you do those or increase those, it's the same thing like exercising, right? If you like how many times you exercise a week, or we could talk about music, like how many times do you practice a week? I did that at one point with guitar, where it was like, the metric wasn't about how good I was. It wasn't about how many songs did I learn. It was how many days a week did I practice? And the goal was to do 7 for a minimum. And for what time? 15 minutes minimum. And those were the 2 things that I tracked. And I did that. But I gave myself permission, if I want to do more, fine.
Sure.
And that's what worked, because it was very doable. And the other stuff came from that.
It's reminding me a lot about the one of the things I do in my consulting practice is job benchmarking. So you're trying to get the key accountabilities, and they need to be in the, you described them perfectly, Steve, where they have to be something that is in their control, that really leads towards success in the role. And that can be defined differently depending on who's viewing that role. So that's the benefit of the benchmarking process, is you get concordance about what success actually looks like. And so we're all using that same metric, because if one department is measuring in this one way and the other one's measuring another way, and then you have these siloing going on, and it doesn't lead towards a trust-based, cooperative, shared mission sort of culture.
Absolutely. You also have to be careful about what you measure because it can cause things to get driven in weird directions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. If you're tracking the wrong things, and again, this is a place where outcome stuff can get problematic. I was recently talking to an educator who was talking about how the district that they worked in was, they wanted to lower suspensions. And so they were tracking how many kids have been suspended. And that's actually not a great metric, because there's any number of variables that can affect that, including just choosing not to suspend people for certain behaviors,
Right.
which is not getting at the actual goal, which is we want improved student behavior. Right. So it's a problematic metric. So we've got to keep an eye on that. And so you also, with any of these things, I mean, this is true with any system, I think, we have to periodically check and be like, are these things aligning? Right. Are these things aligning? And because then that's where other refinements or other things might come in, right? So this might be like, to build on my guitar thing. It's like, yeah, it's all well and good to sit down and practice for 15 minutes a day. But at a certain point, it's also like, you might need to engage in a certain type of practice. Maybe you might need to have lessons, and like, I have at least one lesson a month or whatever, right? You kind of can build on that and add new metrics that help you dial it in, refine it, and build it up. So it's all of these things, I think, are dynamic systems that need to be reviewed and refined over time to truly serve you.
If you're just sitting there doing pentatonic scales for 15 minutes a day, I'm not sure that expands your harmonic theory. And right. So everything's more complicated than first meets the eye. So the note I took from your comment there, Steve, was write in pencil. Right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's very true. And just with anything, like, and this is depending on how you look at it, I would say good or bad, is you understand that all of this stuff is temporary. And I think the bad part about that, we all want safety and certainty and security because it's comforting to us, right? We think like, okay, it's safe. I know what it's going to be. And so when we start looking at like this idea of like, this is all temporary, like that's kind of scary, right? That's a little bit uncomfortable, because we often, again, are focused on danger. And what we're not focused on, I was just talking with a client about this yesterday, is we're focused on that. What we're not focused on and often lose sight of is our ability to navigate things and to deal with challenges. And that, at the end of the day, is a bigger deal, because if you are able to skillfully take on things that show up, it doesn't matter what shows up, right? Life, whether or not we like it or believe it, has a huge element of improv in it. And I've actually recommended that to clients. I've told a lot of clients, like, you need to go take an improv class. And they're like, what does that have to do with business? I'm like, you'll see.
It's funny. It's been on my list of things to do. One of my clients, she did that, and her husband was really into it. And not only have a good time, but she's a sales manager. And so she's trying to get her whole sales team into it. And you're fueling that creative, spontaneous, really listening and reacting, putting yourself in the moment.
Yes.
As opposed to running the script that's already in your head.
Exactly. It teaches you to be attuned to what's happening and then to use what's within you to work with that. And that, I think, is where we start to get to a real sweet spot, right? Is like, sure, use your strengths, your knowledge, your perspective, but apply it to what's actually happening. And you're only going to get that if you're really, really tuned in. Improv is challenging and kind of uncomfortable and goofy, but it is also super fun, and it really, practice it enough and it will give you a much different perspective on dealing with the unknown and uncertain. Because when you start to really see, like, I can actually navigate a lot of stuff. Although I would argue most people, if we went through your life and were like, what are all the unexpected challenges in your life that you have successfully faced and navigated? They'd be shocked at how many they came up with. right? But we lose sight of that because
Yeah.
our brain's all focused on the threats and the dangers, unfortunately, which is good and bad, right? It's a double-edged thing, like so much of this.
Well, the things you were just pointing to there, what our brains want to focus on is really set for a world that has physical danger in it. And most of our modern world, unless you're in a war-torn area or a very dangerous area, most people are not really subject to immediate physical threat. Yet those are the patterns that are at play in our lower part of our brains. So if we elevate those, we are giving a little bit of our agency away. We've got to pay attention to the things that you're pointing to there. That present moment piece is so powerful, and it's where the fun is, right?
Oh, that's the thing. It's like, it's so, we again get caught up in this idea. We want it to go a certain way and it has to go that way or it's not okay, right? This is that perfectionism thing again. And what we lose sight of, but if you go again, dig through your life, you'll find this. Some of the best things that have ever happened to you are not things you even thought to ask for or pursue, but you only really got to enjoy it if when it showed up, you were able to embrace it. And if you're not present, and you're not willing to work with the present moment and to connect to it, you're going to have a really, really hard time with that. And again, this is not to say forget about intentionality, forget about goals. No, by all means, have them, but have a flexibility about it. And that's really, I think, the key here, is really this idea of being flexible enough to have a place you want to go, but be flexible about the path that you end up following to get there, because that's how one, the journey will just be better as far as being more effective and successful. But two, it's also where you'll get some pretty cool surprises. A few that might not be so cool also. But humans are tougher and more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. And I think we've lost sight of that at times. And it's not my favorite thing to do, but getting practice in like our toughness is a useful skill for us, I'll say.
Absolutely. In the Eye of Power model, the one quadrant is called the pain quadrant because of our relationship to pain. And if we're pain averse, we're going to be limiting our power. That's simple as that. And so we have to have a healthy relationship to that. And that's, you just laid out an example of why. The attitude I was thinking about, pointing back to improv, one of the basic tenets is yes and, right? So somebody does something, it's yes, you accept whatever that is, whether it fits your idea or not, and then you go from there.
Totally. Totally. That's uncomfortable for people though, because sometimes what is not what we want. And it doesn't fit our idea of how it is. Right.
So we need to cultivate that sense of play and ability to risk and let go of whatever it is that we're trying to hold on to for whatever reason, huh?
I would say so. The hard part is like, again, we seek that stability and predictability and familiarity because our brains associate that with safety. And there are elements of that that are true. It's also easier, right? It takes us less energy to do the thing we always do. It is so part of this is just the brain being an energy conserving device.
Yep.
But in a world that is changing so fast and it's getting, how fast it's changing is changing, right? It's like,
yes,
it's the senseless acceleration.
Logarithmic curve.
Right. Yeah, totally. And if we're not really refining our ability to adjust, adapt, pivot, refine, whatever, you're going to have some real challenges. So finding the balance of, stability and adaptation or consistency and adaptation is important. But I also, again, think you can sometimes create things that are two seemingly paradoxical things in one. Right. You can have, so I'll give you an example. You can have I'm just making this up as I talk here, but you can have like an adaptation ritual where basically you do a thing of every month you go and you review things, or every so often and you go, what's working well, what's not. So there's still an element of ritual and consistency, but it is facilitating this process of evolving, of changing, or what have you. And there's a ton of stuff about humans that's paradoxical. I used to use this idea of planned spontaneity, which again is like, what? And basically what it was is I just created a space on my calendar where a block of time where when that time showed up, all I would do is be like, what do I feel like doing? And the only rule was that I did what I felt like doing at that moment. Whatever popped up, it didn't matter what it is. It might be read, it might be, whatever. And so it's like, but being able to tune into that, like, how do we find these things? There's a lot of weird contradictions, but we can often navigate them if we're willing to wrestle with it or sit with a little bit, or, talk with someone about it and poke at it. And that's, I think, where this middle ground often exists of how do we make it safe enough for us to be able to travel, right? Where we can just do it, or what have you, but still do so attuned to the reality of the world and its changes and its challenges.
That piece that you just pointed to, the things that seem to conflict, right? There's a lot of paradox in the world, and seemingly opposed and incompatible ideas can both be true. And so the path to wisdom looks like, which one do I lean on at this moment in time? Not
Mhm.
saying that it's always this or always that, but what do I apply given the situation at hand?
Right. Or what relative volumes of them, right? This comes
Yes.
back to some of what we were talking about earlier with the idea of filtering things out, or the concept of constraints is a real, good way to put it is on the surface, you go constraints, that sounds limiting. And yeah, in one sense it is, but the part that people don't often see is when we constrain these inputs or these options, what happens is we are focusing our energy, we're focusing our attention, and that allows us to be more powerful. So the analogy I might make is the difference between a light bulb and a laser, right? A light bulb is, sure, it's light, it's useful, it's very functional, very important thing, but it's just kind of like, here's this light and it's just diffuse, it goes everywhere, and that's nice. And a laser is super focused, super narrow focused, and as a result, it's very powerful and it can do all kinds of incredible things. They both are very useful, but you don't want to use a laser to light your room.
Right.
So, right, they both are useful, but it's being able to manage them. And so at times we need to be more like a light bulb. We need to be like when we're trying to figure out what do we want to do, where do we want to go? We want to kind of be able to scan more around. But when we're trying to really make progress, we want to be more focused like a laser. And that's where constraints become powerful because we keep ourselves from getting distracted, from our energy getting diffused, and all of that.
Wise words. That, and I love that idea of the relative volume piece, where it's kind of related to the yes and, where you're not really rejecting ideas, especially if we're in disagreement about things.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that you're bad. I don't because you think this, you're put the label on. And that's one of the big problems we have in our discourse today about anything that's controversial. And now it's getting worse and worse, so that we really are living in almost two different realities. It's so bad. We can't even agree on what's actually truly happening in the world. And that's where you really have problems. So we have to be big enough to embrace and give the respect, saying, okay, this person is saying this for a reason, and that reason is worth giving enough respect to value and try to understand
Right.
without putting my thing on. And I think that can help us, whether it's a controversial issue or something I disagree with. I think I've already figured that issue out, so I don't have to go back there. Whatever that it is that's making me close off that communication or that consideration, I guess the wisdom that I'm getting from you, Steve, is to respect that and sort of keep that valve open and keep the possibilities open.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of most either or sort of things because most dichotomies like that are not really genuine, legitimate. And as you've pointed out, our society, there's a lot of issues that are contributory there. That's its own kind of thing, but it's often not either or. It's both and the key is it's really about figuring out right the mix or the balance point between the two. And that's like, I lean into the idea of frameworks a lot versus say structures. And that's because again, to me, there some people might even say that's the same thing. It's just semantic. But what I mean is maybe I would differentiate between like a recipe. Like I said, a recipe is like take this much of this and add this much of this, these very clear step-by-step things. Again, fine for certain things, but they're very structured. And it just the open, like, oh, just improv and do whatever you want. It's like a framework is again, it's more of a partial thing where you're like using these concepts or these principles that we know support a certain outcome, but doing them in a way that aligns with what's the reality of the moment. So if you're baking, it might be like, well, what do you have in the kitchen? Like what
Right.
ingredients are available to you and working with those. But also in business, it might be, what are the resources I have available to me within my business, within myself? And then how do I navigate a path that goes where I want to go, but uses those things? Because there's pretty much always more than one way to travel and one way to get there. And so it's not about, we as a society, we like to be like, what's right and what's wrong, because it's simple. Again, it's simple, it's easy, it saves energy, all of that. And it also fits, in a couple bullet points or a 5-second video. But the reality is there's almost always more than one way. And when we do these things that tune inward, what do we have? Who are we? What do we stand for? Then we start to do it in a way that is both authentic to us, but also unique and powerful, which is from the standpoint of, this is more of a marketing thing, but that's how we stand out. That's how we are unique. And that's how we're able to connect with the right people and, do what we're, again, I think, uniquely positioned to do in the world, whatever that happens to be.
Well, you just introduced a whole nother concept there, didn't you? So,
sorry. Yeah. It's one of those coach things. We're always opening doors.
yeah. But the thing that inspired me to think first off of that was the idea of going back to the recipe idea. I like my chili spicier. I like it sweeter. I like beans. I don't like beans. There isn't a right or wrong. It's being in touch with what you think is highest, best. And that could change, right? This week it might be this, might be something else next week or next year or a decade from now. But the point is our sensibilities being dialed into what's deeper and true allows us, because if you think it, odds are good there's going to be others that are going to share that same perception. And the clearer you are within, and therefore your communication or your lines of what you want to call it, however, your connections with the other world, the clearer you are, the more attractive you are to those that see and are harmonic with that particular attribute or frequency or whatever it is. Right. And then when you get that connection, things go better, right? You're not trying to be all things to all people. You're trying to be true to this idea. And then the people that love and appreciate that. And now I've got a tribe or a group or a brand or whatever we might group it. But it's, I think it's that process of clarification that is the key thing, and being authentic and not trying to be all things to all people or I mean, again, it's a little bit tough because we're trying ideas on for size, but we also want to have that clarity. So that's sort of maybe my last question is those two ideas, relative volume. How do we navigate those waters, Steve?
Well, I think it's a refinement over time.
Over time.
It's a refinement over time. And it's also, this is where the more that we're willing to listen to and honor ourselves, the quicker or easier this is to dial in. I think we often let fear interfere with us, right? And so this is in business. I'll give you an example. This is going back to my psychotherapy practice days. But at first, I did a bunch of different things. And my website said that it's like, I do couples, I do anxiety, I do depression, I do codependency, and it's all these different elements. And it was like, that was the part of me. It's like, well, I want to make sure that I'm, appeal to more people. The problem is it made it kind of diffuse, and it worked okay. It wasn't like it didn't work, but it worked okay. But it was there was up and down. And then I got to a point in my practice where I was, one, clearer about what I liked and didn't like and was good at. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try an experiment here. And because I'd heard from marketing people for years about, you've got to be super narrowly focused and niched. And I'm like, really? I don't know about this. And so I go try it, and I'm like, okay, cool. So, and I changed it, and I really wanted to get away from jargon. So it became like, I focus on helping nice guys and people pleasers. And literally that was it. And I was like, it really clear. That's all I do. And almost literally instantaneously, it was like almost overnight. I hate it because I sound like a cliche when I say this, right? Almost overnight, my practice started growing really fast. I was like, what the heck?
Oh, wow.
Right? Because it was really clear. But I had done that work forever. I just had other components around it, and I gradually whittled away. So I think this is where like a sculpting sort of metaphor maybe works. That stuff is there, and it's like, we got to slowly sculpt away the stuff that doesn't belong. But we also, by doing so, become more vulnerable, because it becomes more clear and more exposed. And that requires us being comfortable enough with our own humanness and what we stand for, that we're willing to be okay if people take shots at it, because people will, right? But that doesn't mean it's not valuable. It means it's maybe just not for them. Right. I don't know about you, man, but like, I can only serve so many people at once. I don't need to be for everybody, and I don't really want to be. But what I do want is the right people. And I've also found this too. You probably have too. Like, when I'm really working with the right people, it's a whole different game. It's so different, and it's so
better
much
for
more
everybody.
powerful. It's better for everyone. And so there's plenty of people where it's like, Yeah, no, not me. Yeah, here, let me connect you to this guy who's going to be a better fit for you. And the more that we are really clear about who we are, who we're for, what we're not, the easier it is for our people to find us and to see us, right? It's just scary because it's all out there and it's all visible and it's all vulnerable. And people could be like, why would you bother with that? Or whatever, they're going to say what they're going to say, but so that's the hard part. So learning how to ground ourselves in our own knowledge and comfort that we're okay, we're doing good things, what we do matters, it's relevant, is really fundamentally important, to be, again, comfortable with it, with what is a large degree of vulnerability.
That's pretty poignant. I think that's a pretty good place for us to wrap our discussion. We could go on riffing like this for
Oh
a
yeah,
long time,
totally.
but
And we barely even touched on music, and we could probably go on
I
that
know we
for who
didn't
knows
touch
how
at
long.
all hardly on that. And I saw actually in your bio, Steve, about one question that you suggested is Star Wars or Star Trek, and I thought that'd be a fun thing to talk about too. So
Yeah, I could go on that one for length. Although I think both have merit. To be clear, I'm a Star Trek guy, but Star Wars has a lot of merit too. So you're right. No, I won't even get started because then we will.
we'll have to do this again sometime. We
Totally,
get
man. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate you being on the podcast and very much enjoyed our conversation. And as I feel often with these things, I feel like I have a new friend, right? So I love
Yeah.
that feeling.
No, it's yeah, great. I mean, I love the conversation. I love your questions and like bringing these. It's always so fun to have somebody new asking about these things or looking at these things, because it's a good challenge for me to be thinking and to be rethinking about these things and kind of tweak them or polish them or see like, oh wait, well maybe there's this additional piece here. So it's actually, one, just great to be able to share some of these things, but two, it actually helps me to get clearer and to refine them. So I'm grateful for that opportunity as well.
My pleasure. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been my absolute pleasure to talk with you today. And we went on a long time after the actual show was going on because we could keep going and going. And as it happens to me a lot of the time I'm finding with my interview style formats, I feel like I find new friends all over the world. And that's one of the best feelings. I absolutely love it. So that'll keep me going for quite some time doing this kind of format with my podcasting. But Steve's insights were super valuable. Just a few that I want to highlight before we go. The idea of using somebody else to help us navigate the challenging journey and be able to get past the unseen obstacles. We all have unseen obstacles because we have blind spots and we need other people. Talk about that a lot in the Eye of Power. Our relationship with failure, right? So when we want to get out of overthinking or perfectionism, this is one that I personally have struggled with. I want things to be right. I want to look good. I want to be respected, and I don't want to look foolish or make a mistake or give somebody bad advice even as much as that. So I want to just be very thorough, but you can't help people if you're not in action. So there's a balance there. And so how do you navigate those things? And what Steve pointed to was learning to change your relationship with failure. And I think that's great wisdom. Don't believe everything you think. There's a bumper sticker he saw, and that's a pretty good one. I like that. And that all that does is it points us to that humility and that curiosity, right? Stay in the question. Don't overestimate what you know. And we talked a little bit about that too, that the fundamentals, getting back to basics, beginner's mindset, right? We forget what we forget. And so it's easy for us to miss some of the basic things as time goes on. And I look at very accomplished people who wisely have gone back to the basics. I remember I'm a drummer, so a drummer that everybody looked up to and still does. It was Neil Peart, and everybody name him as he's one of the most influential drummers of the past 50 years. And late in his career, he went back to the basics and studied a whole new technique. And you could have other examples of that. I remember Tiger Woods did that with his golf swing, and because your body changes over time, right? You have to learn and change. And when you make those changes, it makes sense to go back to the very beginning, get things built up as efficiently as possible, and to take advantage of wisdom that has been hard fought and won by other people. So having that humility to always go back there, I think that's very good. I'd asked him about success metrics, and we do a lot of that in my consulting practice, is measuring the right things, getting focus on, how do we tell somebody's succeeding, and what is it that we're really, what are the inputs that are going to lead in that right direction, and get everybody to sort of see it that way. But he pointed to another caveat there, which is write in pencil, right? Make sure that we're revisiting those things, because whatever we're putting our attention to is where our energy is going to flow. And it's subject to revision, because no matter what we thought at the time, things can change. And we could have had some things that we learned from, and we didn't quite see it the same way in the beginning that we did down the road. So we have to be open to making those adjustments. For those that have a tough time with the new, and they want a ritual, he had a couple of things there, an adaptation ritual. So I thought that was a good suggestion, as well as he suggested planned spontaneity. So I thought that was pretty cool, the idea of putting a block of time in your schedule where when it comes, whatever you feel like doing, you do. And I think that's a good way to fuel perhaps the creative element of ourselves, and give ourselves a little bit of that flexibility and freedom that we tend to value. And then finally, we sort of ended where it was the incompatible ideas. Hat's green, hat's red. Look at it from one way. I remember seeing an episode, I think it was Between the Lions, and walk one way, the hat side was green, walk the other way, the other half is red, and they're arguing whether the hat's red or green. And of course, they're both right and they're both wrong. And that's why we want to be able to try on somebody else's perspective on for size and get into that sort of improv, both and, right? Yes, and a collaborative, respectful way to approach communication. So with all of that, I thought that was a lot of actionable items that Steve brought to the show. And thank you once again, Steve. Very much enjoyed our conversation, and glad to have you as a new friend. And thank you for watching and listening to us. And we very much hope you got something valuable for you out of our show today. Be well.
This has been the Eye of Power podcast with Tom Dardick. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank my brother, Scott Dardick, for the music and his music production. If you'd like to reach me, simply email Tom at dardickcommunications.com.